Oh, tell me when my time is up. Okay, so we can chart and we can report to our school board and the other power gods that we have in our school district. If our goal is biliteracy, how many of our kids are on a benchmark trajectory to becoming biliterate? How many numbers, how many kids might need some help in language because we know they're reading fine in Spanish, and how many kids may not be taking on reading in either language? That's quite a different talk than the way we do things now. Okay, we have miles to go before we sleep, and we have lots and lots and lots. So, what I want to, this is a data slide from one of the schools where we just finished a longitudinal study on 58 kids. You'll recognize this one, Wendy, you wrote it. So, if you look at first graders, there's 14 DRA, 14 is the mean in DRA, 14 is the mean in EDL, 8 is the mean in DRA. Now watch, these are the same kids. These are the same kids across grade levels. And somebody might say, but look at the gap in first grade. Gap is a favorite word of ours. Besides the jeans store, it's a favorite word of ours. So people might say, look at the gap between Spanish and English. Look at the same 58 kids across grade levels. What do you notice about the 5th grade outcomes? The gap goes like this. Okay? So that's when you start talking about a trajectory toward biliteracy, that gives you the license to keep on doing what you're doing in literacy in both languages, because then otherwise somebody gets worried about the 2nd grade and says, maybe we should drop Spanish. We're not sure that the kids are getting where we want to go. So you don't want to do that. And it doesn't have to be EDL, DRA. It can be any two tools that have similar psychometric properties. But do not pick a tool that assesses this in one language and this in a second language, because it's not going to get you where you want to go. Okay, so another way we can plot this are our literacy squared students on trajectories toward biliteracy. And so you look, these are the same 58 kids. 50% of them are at first grade, but when you look at 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, 79, 62% of the kids are on a trajectory toward biliteracy. That's a real positive way to talk to your school board. Now we want to shoot for 100 and know that we might not get there. In the 5th grade, our assumption about these kids were a lot of them, if you do too good in Spanish, you know this story, then all of a sudden you get kicked out and the newcomers get put in the program. And so it's very hard to follow kids longitudinally. All right, so what I just told you that we can do in reading, we can also do in writing. And this is a writing rubric that we developed, that Literacy Squared has developed. On the left side is Spanish and on the right side is English. We lay kids' writing samples side by side. How many of you got handouts? Because this is all on a handout, but I didn't bring enough copies. Those aren't mine. Okay, so the writing rubric has 3 areas. It has content, and you see the reds in Spanish, the greens in English.
We'll be addressing that. And the work comes out of, we just recently published the Translanguage in Classroom, leveraging student bilingualism for learning. And wow, my picture doesn't look very good right there. But I wanted to show you the other co-authors, Ofelia Garcia, Kate Seltzer, and then myself. Fortunately, that picture is not very good, but this is the cover of our book. And I'll be sharing with you some of the work that we included there today. In particular, looking at the translanguaging progressions and what those are. So I want to start off with a couple of slides about kind of looking at monoglossic language ideologies and what that is. So it's definitely the dominant education policy and practice for emergent bilinguals, legitimizes language practices of monolinguals as the norm, reproduced in dual language and immersion programs, based on ideologies conceptualized of bilinguals and double monolinguals. And I think Dr. Escamilla talked about that. And so I just wanted to talk about that and mention what is monoglossic when we talk about that, kind of the 2 bilinguals in one and so forth. Because our philosophy or perspective is coming more from a translanguaging. And I'll read these to you because I think it's important and foundational in the work that we're doing with translanguaging. So translanguaging is an internal system governing bi- and multilingual storage retrieval and use of their repertoire of linguistic features. Discursive practices of bilingual and multilinguals that make use of their full linguistic repertoire. We don't distinguish between, again, two different monolinguals. It is a full linguistic repertoire, and that's how we represent translanguage. And then lastly, there's pedagogical practices that support the above. And so I will move into that to kind of make it more, instead of concepts, look at more concretely at it. So the framework of the work that we've been doing with translanguaging is, what you see here at the top is the translanguaging, students' translanguaging progressions, which include general linguistic performance, language-specific performance, and then lastly, the dynamic translanguage progressions that I will be addressing today. The translanguaging corriente here, and that you see here at the center, is in essence, it's kind of the energy and the students' bilingualism that flows throughout all our classrooms. And you probably have heard it, seen it, sensed it in your classrooms when they're translanguaging and when they're making sense of text or processing and so forth. And then lastly, the last piece there is a part there, a component, is the translanguaging pedagogy. And actually, right after this session, myself and a couple other panelists will be sharing our work in regards to translanguaging in mathematics and science and language arts. So you're welcome to join us at La Fonda. So going to this component here of our framework, the first one is the students' translanguaging performances. And so as I said, it has three within it, and it's the general linguistic, language-specific performance, and the dynamic translanguaging progressions. So first of all, so what is this kind of construct, this idea? And what it is bilingual speakers to show what they can do and deploy any of the features in their language repertoires to accomplish language and content-specific skills or tasks. So it's general linguistic performance using the full features of students' linguistic repertoire. So let me give you an example. So here's an example of Carla, a fourth grade teacher in a dual language bilingual education context that found a space for translanguaging, and she called it the Cuéntame Algo space. You could call it whatever you want. It could be the dialogue journal space. It could be the Cuéntame Algo. It could be the pictorial input space. However it is, she found it in this space right here, and this is the text that she was reading, Lluvia de Plata, by the author there, Sarah Put Herrera. But what she did is it's basically a read aloud. Spoke with read to the students, and in their thinking and their process, and in even figuring out different questions that she asked for comprehension, they used their full linguistic repertoire in order to be able to make sense of the text that they had. Then language specific is a little different. So you can see that
handout is a grid, that categorizes these spelling approximations into 5 different categories. And notice first, Spanish spelling approximations. This is the student's best guess as to how that English word might have been spelled using Spanish spelling conventions. And then a second category, absent English phonemes. In other words, the student, there is no equivalent of that phoneme in Spanish, so they make their best guess. They try to approximate it as close to as they can to the way it sounds like in Spanish. And then English phoneme collapse. In other words, oftentimes long vowels will be spelled with the short Spanish vowel because that phoneme doesn't exist in Spanish. And unfamiliar English spelling patterns like little, L-I-T-T-L-E. They're not going to be familiar with that spelling pattern necessarily because in Spanish every letter has a sound, except for the U, of course, and the H. And so applying those English spelling patterns like the C, long vowel, C, consonant, long vowel, consonant, silent E pattern is one that they're not familiar with in Spanish. And then word boundaries. That means where words end and begin and not running them together, because we know that oftentimes it sounds as if as if they're all one sound. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little quiz. I'll show you the spelling approximation, and you guess what the student was trying to spell. Okay, let's see our answers. Okay, so those are examples of Spanish spellings applied to English words. Their best guess as they transfer between the two languages. Okay, second category. Spelling approximations for phonemes that don't exist in English. Let's try to do these. Brother.